By the time Marin Cole sat down across from me, Compound Vel-9 had a clean record across 11 species. Clean in the way a scalpel is clean, not sterile but precise. Trace dose, systemic cascade, cessation of higher neural function inside 4 minutes. We had the telemetry on all 11. We had the dose curves. We had the graphs that showed a flat line where a nervous system used to be. What we did not have until that morning in Suite 4 was a human. She was 31 years old, contract atmospheric technician, cleared for non-invasive research participation under MERIT 7 Standard Labor Supplement Agreement. She had filled out the intake form in 11 minutes, which was fast. She had listed her occupation, her dietary notes, and a mild sensitivity to high-pitched sound. Under prior medical interventions, she had written 3 entries: a broken left radius at age 9, a surgical repair of a torn knee ligament at 24, and what she described as a pretty bad flu maybe 2 years ago. That was the whole of it. No modifications, no augmentation, no documented tolerance training. A standard human as far as any file could tell. My name is Sovan D. Howe. I have spent 31 years in biochemical evaluation. Before that morning, I believed I had seen most of what a toxicological trial could show me. Seth Aaron, our regulatory validation board observer, arrived 6 minutes before the session opened. He set his recorder on the table, positioned his certification pad beside it, and said nothing else. Seth had observed 42 compound evaluations in his career. He told me once that he found the work relaxing. By the 4th hour of that session, he had stopped looking at his recorder entirely. We ran the standard pre-trial panel first: blood chemistry, neural conductance baseline, respiratory function, core temperature. The human sat still through all of it, occasionally glancing at the monitoring array with mild curiosity. Her baseline numbers were unremarkable: slightly elevated iron, resting heart rate at 62. Everything within documented human normal range, which we had on file as a reference category. Not as a subject class we had ever evaluated against Vel-9. I placed the first measure on the table in front of her. 12 micrograms in solution, suspended in a neutral carrier fluid to mask the compound's natural acidity. 12 micrograms was 1/3 of the established lethal threshold for the Vethani, who were our nearest cross-reference species in terms of neural complexity. 1/3 of the dose that had dropped a Vethani test subject in 90 seconds. "Is this it?" she asked. "Yes," I said. She drank it. We watched the array. My colleague Penn Vorith stood at the secondary monitor and said nothing. Rael, our junior technician, had his hands clasped behind his back. Seth Aaron's stylus hovered over his certification pad, ready to begin the incident notation that would formally close the session. 40 seconds, 60. The telemetry came back clean, neural conductance unchanged, respiratory function unchanged. Heart rate had risen 2 beats per minute, which was within the variation margin of her baseline. Marin Cole set the empty measure down and made a small face. "It's bitter," she said. "Not bad, just there's something at the back of it." I looked at Penn. Penn looked at the readouts. I said, "Please hold still for a moment." We ran the panel again. Clean. Every marker inside the normal range. The compound was in her bloodstream. The trace detection array confirmed absorption, but it was not doing what it was supposed to do, what it had done to 11 prior species in 1/3 of that concentration. I increased the dose. Vel-9 had what our classification system called an asymptotic lethality curve, meaning the dose required to achieve lethality did not increase linearly. It plateaued early and stayed flat. Across all 11 reference species, the window between first physiological response and cessation of neural function was narrow enough to be effectively the same event. You did not get a subject who felt unwell for a while and then recovered. You got a subject who stopped. The second measure was 36 micrograms, 3 times the Vethani lethal threshold. Full lethality concentration for 2 of the 11 reference species at this dose level. She drank it in 2 swallows. I watched the array for 2 full minutes. Penn had stopped writing anything down. Rael had quietly moved to stand beside the emergency response panel, not because protocol required it at this stage, but because he was a young technician and his instincts were still calibrated to what compounds were supposed to do. The telemetry came back clean. "I can feel it now," Marin said. She was sitting forward slightly, her elbows on the table, turning the empty measure over in her hands. "It's like, you know, when you have too much caffeine on an empty stomach, that sort of bright feeling. Is that what you're looking for?" Caffeine was a methylxanthine compound with mild central nervous system stimulant properties, documented in human dietary culture as a low-grade psychoactive substance derived from a native earth plant. I had it in my reference files. I knew what it was. I did not know what to say to her. "We are still gathering baseline data," I said. She nodded and sat back. Penn came to stand beside me. He kept his voice low. "The absorption markers are normal," he said. "The compound is metabolizing. Sovan, it's metabolizing. Something in their hepatic processing is." "I know," I said. "At this concentration for the Vithani." "I know what the Vithani numbers say." I looked at the array. "Pull the full hepatic metabolite panel. I want to see what the breakdown products look like." The results came back in 4 minutes. Vel-9's breakdown products in the 11 reference species were themselves acutely toxic, a secondary cascade that compounded the primary neural suppression. It was part of what made the compound so effective. The molecule didn't just disrupt function, it left residue that continued disrupting function after the parent compound had cleared. In Marin Cole's bloodstream, the breakdown products were being processed, cleared. Her liver was generating metabolic byproducts. I didn't have reference values for compounds our array wasn't cataloged to interpret, but the toxic cascade wasn't materializing. The molecule was being taken apart and the pieces were being filed somewhere harmless. I escalated to the 3rd dose. 90 micrograms. This was the full-spectrum lethal concentration, the dose that had produced systemic cessation in all 11 reference species, in every trial, without exception. This was the dose where our incident notation protocols required Seth Aaron to be positioned near the door with his emergency authorization code ready. Seth Aaron was not near the door. He was standing at the secondary array with his certification pad held flat against his side, watching the readouts with the expression of a man who had stopped expecting the numbers to behave. I placed the 3rd measure on the table. Marin picked it up, looked at it, then looked at me. "Bigger one this time," she said. "Yes," I said. She drank it. The room was quiet for the kind of minute that takes longer than 60 seconds to pass. Penn had both hands on the edge of the primary console. Rael had stopped moving entirely. I watched the telemetry with the specific attention you pay to something when you are waiting for it to become an emergency. Neural conductance unchanged, respiratory unchanged, cardiac 67 beats per minute up 5 from baseline, core temperature nominal. The hepatic metabolite panel lit up with activity. Her liver was working. That was the word that occurred to me, working, the way an engine works, the way a system under load sounds different from a system at rest. The compound was going in and something was happening to it, something efficient. "Okay, that one's stronger," she said. She had her hand flat on the table, palm down, and she was looking at it with mild interest. "I can feel my hands, not bad, just aware of them. Is that a normal response?" "It is for you," I said, which was not a lie but was the most honest answer I had. She looked up at me and smiled slightly. "That's a very careful way to answer." We held the session at 90 micrograms for 40 minutes. I ran the full panel 6 times. Penn ran parallel traces on the secondary system to rule out equipment failure, which we both knew wasn't the issue, but which needed to be ruled out formally so the record was clean. Seth Aaron never opened his incident notation. He did not sign his certification form. He stood at the secondary array and watched the numbers return normal results in regular intervals, like a metronome set to a tempo that had no right to exist. At the 40-minute mark, I told Maren we were going to take a break. She said, "Can I get something to drink? Not water, something with flavor. That aftertaste is still sitting there." I looked at Penn. Penn looked at Rail. Rail went and found her a cup of something from the station's provisions, a warm Carathan grain beverage, mildly sweet, which was the closest thing we had on the level. He brought it back and set it in front of her. She drank half of it, nodded, and said, "That helps. What was in the stuff you gave me, if you don't mind me asking? Just curious about the bitter part." I said, "A compound we are currently evaluating." She said, and finished the grain beverage. I stepped away from the table and pulled Penn to the far end of the suite. Rail stayed with the subject. Seth Aaron remained at the secondary array, his back to the table, scrolling through readout history with the slow, methodical attention of a man rechecking his own arithmetic. "We can't escalate further without a new authorization tier," Penn said quietly. "I know. The documentation for this session is going to require a full metabolic workup before we can file anything. The breakdown products alone." "I know, Penn." "Soven," he stopped. "What do we file it as?" "Vel 9 is classified as a Category 1 compounds-based incapacitation agent. Universal lethality confirmed 11 species. That classification carries treaty weight. 3 separate interstellar compacts reference this compound's threat profile in their prohibited substance accords." He paused. "What do we call it now?" I thought about what to call it. I had the words for every outcome in our protocol documentation except this one. "We call it what the data shows," I said, "and we let the compacts sort out what that means for the accords." When we returned to the table, Maren was sitting as she had been, elbows on the table, relaxed, turning the empty grain cup slowly in her hands. Her telemetry was still running. I could see the readout from where I stood. Heart rate, 64, back down from its session peak. The compound was clearing her system the way a spent meal clears, methodically, without distress, without consequence. She looked up when I sat down. "Are we done?" she asked. "For today," I said. "I have a few questions for you before you go." "Sure." I asked her about her dietary habits. She described them as ordinary, varied, with no particular restrictions. I asked about her medical history beyond what the intake form listed. She confirmed there was nothing significant. I asked, carefully, whether she had any exposure to similar compounds in the past. She thought about it. "I mean, I've worked atmospheric contract jobs since I was 22. Some of those environments have stuff in the air you'd rather not breathe, but I've never had a reaction," she shrugged. "I guess I run clean." I asked, finally, whether she had noticed any aftertaste remaining from the earlier measures. "Yeah, still there a little," she said. "Is that a problem?" "No," I said, "it will pass." She nodded, said thank you, collected her things, and left the suite. I sat at the primary console for a long time after the door closed. The telemetry array was still running its post-session traces, all of it unremarkable, all of it within the documented normal range for a human adult at rest. Seth Aaron came and stood beside me. He had his certification pad in both hands. His validation form was open on the screen but unsigned. He looked at the pad, then at the array. "I'll need to refer this session to the Compounds Review Board," he said. "The standard validation form doesn't have a field for this." "No," I said, "it doesn't." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been in this role for 22 years, he said. 42 evaluations. I have never referred a session to the board." "I know." He tucked the unsigned form under his arm. "What will you put in the trial record?" I thought about Vel 9's 11 species file, the dose curves, the flat lines where nervous systems had been, the decades of interstellar regulatory weight that sat on that compound's classification like a stone slab. I opened the session record. In the outcome field, I typed a single line. Compound demonstrated no incapacitation effect in human subject at full-spectrum lethal concentration. Reclassification recommended pending metabolic study. Seth Aaron read it over my shoulder. He didn't say anything. He picked up his recorder from the table, his stylus from beside it, and walked to the door. He paused there, one hand on the frame. "She asked if there was a version without the bitter aftertaste," he said. "Yes," I said. He left. I sat with the record open on the screen and thought about what the Compounds Review Board would do with it, and what the treaty compacts would do after that, and what it meant that a substance we had spent a decade classifying as an instrument of irreversible destruction had registered in a human bloodstream as a thing mildly worth commenting on. She had described it as a bright feeling. I closed the session file and began the paperwork for a full metabolic analysis. Somewhere on the station, Marin Cole was eating lunch, and the bitter aftertaste was fatting, and she was not thinking about any of this at all.